The Cuban Missile Crisis was a conflict between the world's two nuclear superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. After U-2 spy planes flew over Cuba, they discovered sites that harbored nuclear weapons. In Kennedy's speech, he describes such weapons and their capabilities.
The characteristic of these new missile sites indicate two distinct types of installations. Several of them include medium-range ballistic missiles, capable of carrying a nuclear warhead for a distance of more than 1,000 nautical miles. Each of these missiles, in short, is capable of striking Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral, Mexico City, or any other city in the southeastern part of the United States, in Central America, or in the Caribbean area. Additional sites not yet completed appear to be designed for intermediate range ballistic missiles, capable of traveling more than twice as far, and thus capable of striking most of the major cities in the Western Hemisphere, ranging as far north as Hudson's Bay, Canada, and as far south as Lima, Peru. In addition, jet bombers, capable of carrying nuclear weapons, are now being uncrated.
Following his speech, Kennedy detailed the steps he wished to take against the Cuban and Soviet communist countries, consisting of initiating a naval blockade to stop any ships headed to Cuba, increasing surveillance and putting armed forces on alert, strengthening Guantanamo Bay, and finally holding Khrushchev accountable and order him to bring back the once stable balance between the United States and the Soviet Union by withdrawing such nuclear weapons. The term quarantine was used instead of blockade because under the United Nations Charter, a blockade would be considered as an act of war, and the United States wanted the UN support without violating the Charter. In William J. Maitland's article, The Cuban Missile Crisis, Evolving Historical Perspectives, the steps permitted a more controlled escalation on the part of the United States and required Khrushchev to be the first to initiate any military action. This kind of action, according to Maitland, Kennedy gave Khrushchev no chance to withdraw his mistake or to save face. He left little room for bargaining, but instead issued a public ultimatum and seemed willing to destroy millions in the process. This was seen when Kennedy had requested his Secretary of Defense to map out a strategy of how to go on about invading Cuba before the missiles were to be launched, risking a nuclear launch from the Soviet Union in another location. This was reflected by Paul H. Neitz, who was Undersecretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. I am struck that many of us consider military action almost inevitable, almost from the outset. As I recall, much of the discussion about the use of force, especially an invasion of Cuba, hinged upon whether the Soviets had already deployed nuclear warheads to the island. We operated on the assumption that it was unlikely Moscow would take such a risk, but that these could arrive at any time. As it turned out, at a conference in 1989 on the Cuban crisis, a Soviet participant revealed that they had already delivered some warheads, so the possibility of war had been greater than suspected. It was 6 days after his speech on October 28th that both the United States and the Soviet Union reached an agreement. Kennedy was to withdraw all nuclear missiles from Turkey and Italy, and Khrushchev would withdraw its missiles from Cuba. For many, this was seen as JFK's mark as a patient, tactical, and careful leader. However, in Thomas G. Patterson's article, October Missiles and November Elections, The Cuban Missile Crisis and American Politics of 1962, it was all a farce. A Republican standing for re-election, Republican Thomas B. Curtis of Missouri, told voters in his district that the Cuban Missile Crisis was phony and contrived for election purposes. They suspected that the Kennedy administration had played politics with foreign policy to help Democrats in the congressional elections on November 6th. But we already saw in Paul Neitz's testimony, the Soviets had indeed delivered nuclear warheads to Cuba, and the crisis helped put the Soviet Union on the spotlight, and perhaps it stopped them from launching the warheads that had been delivered. Yet despite all that, we cannot ignore the fact that the world was on the brink of nuclear destruction, and both countries proceeded with caution and held their breaths in the hope that neither of them would strike first. We should give credit to both Kennedy and Khrushchev for fixing what they had started, coming to a peaceful agreement, and establishing the balance back into place.